When we talk about black people in the United States, we're talking about people who are descended from slaves. And I think despite sort of knowing that there's a lot of racial diversity even among that group, that we still ascribe to the one-drop rule. And so, sort of any phenotypic suggestion of African origin, and you're lumped into that category. We have a growing black immigrant population in the United States that's now at about 10% of the black population as of the 2010 census. And again, most of the time when we're doing sociological or social psychological research on kind of identity and attitudes and those kinds of things, we tend to just lump all of those people together. If their parents were born in the U.S., then they're U.S. Citizens, and so we lump them as black, even though when we study Asians or we study Latinos, we tend to think about first, second generation kind of distinctions. It has always struck me, I think in part because I'm biracial, and I grew up in an all-white neighborhood and struggled with kind of identity issues myself, that there are lots of different ways to be black and to feel a strong connection, to have a strong black identity. And so one of the things I wanted to be able to do was to pay more attention to that. The other thing is that we have always, I think, tended to assume that black people are either assimilationist or nationalist, when in fact one can hold aspects of both at the same time. And that there's both political nationalism and a cultural nationalism, and that you can feel very strongly in terms of having a cultural nationalism and maybe not have so much of the political nationalism. And so I wanted to be able to pay attention to those things, to sort of think about how we tend to characterize black people and black identity, but also eventually to look at how those different dimensions of identity might help us understand their college experiences. Psychology has actually done a better job of thinking about the various dimensions of identity, and so I wanted to bring some of that to sociology and see what we could find, especially in this moment where we're talking about being post-racial, and Barack Obama and many of the other blacks in his administration represent a different kind of non-stereotypic black person. They come from elite colleges and universities. They're very well traveled. They're racially very diverse. And that's not something that we've had a lot of experience with, but we also have made a lot of assumptions about them, so that one could argue that what made Barack Obama a viable candidate for a lot of those swing voters was that he wasn't really black, or he wasn't black like those black people that make me uncomfortable. And so the students that you're talking about in my study are the next generation of those black people. They're at elite universities, they're getting all of these experiences. Racially, they're much more diverse than we've ever seen before, not only in terms of racial classification, but in terms of immigrant origins. And so there's a lot to be learned, I think, about not only what they think about in terms of what it means to be black and how important being black is for them, but also sort of at some point what they think about each other. How much do they have in common, or how different are they with respect to the different heritage and nativity statuses that they bring to the mix, and their different class statuses that they bring to the mix. One of the really interesting things for us was that class really didn't matter. There was very rarely in fact, there is not a single class characteristic that cuts across all of the groups and all of the dimensions of identity as predictive of, if your family owns their home, then you're assimilationist. It's very spotty and it's very weak. There are certainly differences by nativity status and heritage, so certainly the monoracial, multi-generational Native blacks have expressed the strongest sort of racial centrality, and mixed race blacks the weakest, but for mixed race blacks, it's still pretty important. It's much more important, I think, than most would assume. And these are students who self-identified as mixed. So we know how they identify themselves, but we also know that being black is an important part of their self-concept, just not as important as it is for monoracial native blacks, and immigrant blacks tend to fall in between those two. The interesting thing was that what seems to matter most consistently is their experience with structural inequality. So residential segregation and exposure to violence and social disorder had the strongest impact across dimensions and for everybody. And so, we make an argument that in fact, it's going to be that experience of racial inequality, the sort of structural barriers that are going to matter more than these individual class characteristics, and to some degree more than how people self-identify and what their particular heritage is, because they're still forced to exist in this structure that defines race and pigeonholes us in particular ways and then responds to us accordingly.